Welcome everyone to the Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast. I'm your host, Dave Klein. Today we're going to talk about anxiety-free vulnerability management with Magda Chelly. So as you know, the number of vulnerabilities we're dealing with today, and we'll get into this in the conversation in a little more depth, is about 600% more vulnerabilities than merely 10 years ago, right? It became something in the past that you dealt with kind of as a passing. Now it's quite rampant, and it really is something that we have to look at today, because time to exploit is often within hours after a vulnerability is announced. So today we're going to talk about attack-based vulnerability management and the ability to mitigate some of these problems and find ways to effectively fix them. I'm here with Dr. Magda Chelly. Magda, how are you?
Hi, Dave. I'm very good. Thank you. How are you?
Awesome. And you know, every week I do a Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast, a newscast. And this week, you know, as with in the past, I often find very interesting stories about cybersecurity in Asia. And there was one this week I thought was interesting to bring up. A firm called Valexi found a new attacker called Drifting Cloud. It was a Chinese nation state attacker who was attacking Asian businesses and governments, and was caught when they went after one particular business using a Sophos firewall vulnerability, right? A brand new day zero, it was found, and they were very sophisticated. They were able to get into that appliance, the VPN appliance, create a DNS man-in-the-middle kind of technique, and see everything that went by, and found all the administrative passwords and credentials and things like that. Fortunately, they were shut down very quickly, and Sophos has gone ahead and released patches and updates for it. But it really reminded me of the importance of cybersecurity in the Asian theater. And I just want to know what your thoughts are. You know, when you talk to people, you know, are CISOs feeling that their executives and their business are listening to them?
Well, I think, Dave, first of all, this topic is extremely important, but also very challenging for companies. So when we're talking about an expanding attack surface in general nowadays, managing vulnerabilities across the surface is not anymore limited by a perimeter, but also with them, the employees working from home or anywhere, is becoming really a big challenge. And CISOs, if they are available within those companies in Asia, have a big task to achieve, not only because they might not have the right resources or the big teams to address that, but also because they might have a lack of visibility when it comes to those vulnerabilities. So I think, you know, this topic, if we start the introduction and the discussion about it, is not only very interesting, but also requires the right fundamentals to address vulnerability management. And like the title of this today discussion is, without this anxiety, right, that it might create. And I want to, you know, like start with a story, my own experience. Had still situations where literally the vulnerabilities were listed in an Excel file and needed to be addressed and reported using those Excel files that were tremendously long. And now I don't need to tell you for sure how challenging and difficult was that, not only from the reporting perspective, but as well to understand what required attention and what didn't require attention.
Right, exactly. And you think about those Excel files that you and I kind of grew up with in IT. And today we talked about, we started 600% more today than 10 years ago. Let's talk about this. So the past 3 years, each had about 30,000 new vulnerabilities, which is intense, right? And again, this is 600% more than it was in 2010. But more than that, if you look at CVE details, which is one of the places that tracks all these vulnerabilities, you're talking about, by the end of 2021, about 167,000 vulnerabilities, right? Vulnerabilities in general. So not just the new vulnerabilities, but over a long period of time. And today, by the way, I actually checked, we're at 178,000, so even more than it was at the beginning of the year. And the bigger part of it is, it seems like more of them have a higher vulnerability rating. So for example, there's about 20,000 out there that have a score of 9 or above, which means remote code executable, right? So the idea is, you think of the spreadsheets and saying we have 20,000 that could eat our lunch immediately. And then you have all these 167,000, 170,000, 180,000 more in the background. It really gets frustrating. It makes that manual way of going after these things almost impossible.
Well, absolutely. But I think, if we look at the overall, again, challenges, the first point in vulnerability management is understanding where can those vulnerabilities occur and what are the types of vulnerabilities. You, for example, now mentioned just the remote code execution. I have seen as well situations where just by looking at a CVE rating or the RCE, the team would just immediately roll out a critical or emergency patch. However, they did not check if one, it's exploitable, if actually it is relevant to the environment, because sometimes we have additional criteria that makes an exploit possible to be used, right, in that particular setup, again, of the company. So one, first understanding what is a vulnerability, where it happens, and what are the types that we might be facing within an environment of our companies. And then, second, understand if those vulnerabilities that we are able to detect are relevant to us. Because not only about checking, oh, we are using a firewall XYZ and we have a critical vulnerability available, that means that it is exploitable for us. Now, why this is relevant is because when you have 3 vulnerabilities to fix, that's manageable. But when you have 300,000, that becomes really, really difficult. And it all depends and expands on the environment that you're working with. So when you have 300,000 vulnerabilities, let's say from, very old ones that maybe you haven't detected previously and now you need to fix, then it's a matter of prioritizing not only the fixes, but as well your resources, the time, etc. So we're coming back to the first point that I mentioned. But I think we just don't realize when we talk about vulnerability management the practical challenges on the ground when it happens, and how the security teams sometimes really have one, either a very, very big scope, or two, a limited amount of information to take the right decisions on how to patch and when to patch, and how to address a very expanded number again of vulnerabilities.
It sounds like it's really kind of important is beyond just understanding first and third party security controls, things that, what is the impact of this vulnerability? Is it going to actually cause an issue in our environment, or do we have these mitigating controls that we can put in place to take care of it? There's some other reasons for that too, right? The idea is that patches sometimes break things, right? The idea of not being able to go through a period of time and say, okay, I'm going to put this in the QA environment first. Okay, so it breaks my SAP deployment, or it breaks my other ERP system or my communication system. The idea sounds like also what's really important is to be able to give yourself that breathing room, not only to find out what would be a problem in our environment, right? But also, do we have time to check to see if we can QA if this is going to break something or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And now, usually, patch management requires that testing, right?
Yeah.
However, if we look at the critical exploit that we have there, and an enterprise that is pretty big size that requires very strict process, we end up having 3 weeks of testing before the patch is deployed. So of course there is a window that allows cyber criminals to use that exploit and just, compromise the company. This is the first thing. The second thing that practically happens very often is that whenever we try as security teams to launch patches, even if though there are automated tools that allow us to do that, there is certainly a percentage of failures. And this is, of course, like anything, like if you want to update a system and then there might be something that doesn't work, or there might be a manual process that requires, or something else that leads to that patch being failed or doesn't actually, it doesn't work. And therefore, it's still a certain number of devices remain vulnerable at that point of time. And it requires manual check and verification that how many have been successfully applied, how many are still failed, or how many have some issues that require manual, for example, configuration or others. So I still struggle to see sometimes maybe comments or feedback that, hey, we have an automated tool, or we have some possibilities to manage those patches just by looking at the CVEs, criticalities, and our team should be able to do that. It's not just a simple a click on a button exercise that will fix everything. It is a very heavy process, and like you mentioned, breaking things is a very big concern as well of companies. If you have a critical operation application and then you require a system to be patched and that application doesn't work anymore, then you might be losing revenue as a business. So how do you manage that? What is the balance between ensuring that you consider critical patches as a priority, but at the same time you understand that you can't just interrupt business operations because there is an update, right? In the middle of, for example, a peak of revenue generating time window. So again, taking a step back, perhaps first of all understanding the fundamentals of vulnerability management, and then looking on how the number of vulnerabilities, like you mentioned, increased tremendously, but at the same time, the challenges, of course, related to those as well. And it requires a much more heavier process in order to achieve efficient patch management for companies and, of course, security teams.
Excellent. And with that in mind, let's talk about attack-based vulnerability management. And there's several things about it that help address the idea of what seems like an overwhelming number of vulnerabilities and things like that. And the first thing I think we could talk about is discovery. Now, why is discovery so important?
Well, Dave, if you ask me, of course, I think that's a fundamental. You can have control only on things that you know, right? So if you are unable to discover the vulnerabilities within your environment, you are unable to address them. And I want to come back to my example previously. I mentioned 300,000 vulnerabilities. So imagine a very big company having, let's say, 100,000 employees with different devices, different software, different hardware. So when you try to actually discover the vulnerabilities within all that environment, you might not have a full visibility. You might have a limited visibility, and already that visibility will be overwhelming with a number of vulnerabilities across the different devices that is very big, that requires visibility of that status. Did that patch work or not? If we launch, an update, for example. Now, this is one, but also what is really critical is that the discovery requires you to have the means to discover. How will you see if there is a vulnerability on a device that is, for example, not connected on a network or not syncing? And those are also practical issues that happen. Even the status of that particular device might not reach your centralized system if it's not connected to your network. So I think the discovery not only has challenges from the perspective of expanding environment and perimeter-less challenges that we see today with, of course, the work from home and work from anywhere policies, but as well from the perspective that we need a way to detect those vulnerabilities from devices that are anywhere. And that means most commonly an agent, for example, on the device, which happened and was very popular as well in the latest years. And of course, when I say license and agent, it means cost. And that means that the company usually chooses a specific scope to ensure that they have visibility on a particular number of devices. And then we might forget the discovery beyond that particular scope, and we're missing as well other potential entry point for cyber criminals where we don't have visibility, and therefore we might not have that capability of discovery.
And I'd argue probably be agent and agentless, right? The idea is you want to have agents, and for your critical crown jewels that you know of, absolutely agents, because it's much more, as you said, than whether you have something, a vulnerable piece of software on a device or object or application, whether it's exploitable. You want to know how it interacts with its security controls. And then if it breaks something, right? If you apply a patch and it breaks it, you need an agent for that. But also Agentless is also important for discovery of things like phantom IT, right? Things that get put out at a departmental level or developer level. People load things themselves, right? People load applications themselves that they think they need. Working from home means sometimes other people are using that machine as well, right? So the idea is the asset tracking is not complete, but definitely a discovery agent, agentless, and most importantly, continuous. Because I think you talked about for the fact that sometimes devices aren't there at certain hours, and sometimes they come back, and sometimes they're connected, sometimes they're not. So the idea of a continuous discovery process that feeds into your attack-based vulnerability management is really kind of critical, which is excellent. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, I wanted to just add as well, the agentless as well, while it can help, it all depends as well. We need to realize on the configuration and setup that we have in place. Practically, an agentless tool that helps us to perform discovery of vulnerabilities is not magic. And I'm sure our security, peers know how difficult it might be to ensure that we have full visibility, that we have gathered all the IP addresses that we are able to gather in order for the tool to discover. And that means a very good asset visibility or asset management that allows us to know what we need to discover and where. So again, I mean, the full fundamentals of cybersecurity is know your crown jewels, know what you need to protect, have control, and then apply what you need in terms of those controls that will mitigate the risk. But in complex environment like nowadays, where we have no perimeter and we have a lack of visibility, those discovery steps will be much more challenging than previously.
Agreed. That's true. And that's why you need that continuous nature of it. And also feedback, right? And the idea of who's involved in this project. It's not just your cybersecurity staff, it's your IT staff, it's your business staff, right? They need the business staff understands this could be business impactful if something goes wrong, right? I don't want to do everything right and find out that I have one person who loaded a piece of software that was not valid and got us in trouble, or what have you. So the idea of having the business in there, having the IT people in there to know, hey, you know what, you forgot a range to look at, or hey, you know what, we just acquired another company. Here's their IP range. Let me give you contact with someone over there so we can load some agents over there so we can get some more feet on the ground to see what's going on and eyes on target, as we say, from the DoD side of the house, to make it sense, which is true. And asset management, and often we say asset management. There's several stores of asset management in companies, and bringing them all together to help with that. Talking about next thing is I think the other thing is what devices. I think people are so used to servers and workstations, whether they be virtual or real. From my background, when I worked at Cisco, I can't tell you how many times, Magda, I would go into a company and help them with a firewall upgrade. And the last time I saw them was 2 years ago. And I'd see the backup files with the .dk for Dave Klein as the last file on that machine. And saying, wait, you haven't patched these since I've been here last? Those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, again, it comes down to the fact that many companies in general do not realize what type of vulnerabilities they can be out there. They perceive or think that it's just an operating system update that is required, perhaps, or maybe an application update. I have conducted several awareness sessions, and those are not IT security folks, but they might be just employees of companies. And they were very surprised to understand that there are many types of vulnerabilities: hardware, software, firmware. They were not aware. And therefore, if a company doesn't actually have the awareness of the type of vulnerabilities, then employees do not, for example, understand why they need to connect their laptop sometimes to the network or even restart the laptop. And this is, again, a practical example that was a very big challenge, because we couldn't actually, at some point when I was working on this project, we couldn't get that connectivity from, for example, employees somewhere else, and we lost track and visibility of that device. So how do you do that in order to ensure an efficient adoption of, I would say, all those practices is by raising awareness even about something like that. There is a need, or there is a reason why we ask you, for example, to restart your laptop on a certain time frame or every Monday morning. Maybe, take it this way.
Yes. On top of that, the other source, I mean, we talked about figuring out what to discover, what to test and look for, is also today the number one platform choice is software as a service, right? When you and I are out there, so what we got this new XYZ package. Well, how can I get it? Well, we need 20 Windows 2016 servers. All right, what's the other way of getting it? Well, it's a managed service. I do the managed service, right? And everyone is that's kind of platform of choice. So talk to me about suppliers, MSSPs, security providers and vendors for a second, and how that fits into this equation.
Well, I would say, first of all, companies deciding to outsource some part of their operations, especially when it comes to IT, need absolutely to consider patch management and security updates in their contractual clauses. You can't expect your vendor or MSP to take care of the security fixes and updates by themselves unless it's clearly mentioned. And this specifically applies in Asia. I have seen it several times, and I'm seeing it almost every day. For example, there is a deployment of technology. However, the maintenance is not including security updates. So unless you have that very clearly mentioned, make sure that you ask in writing your vendor or your provider, and you agree on the timelines as well. We're talking about patch management, but what does it mean if they tell you, yes, we will manage your patches and we update your application? When? What about the critical findings and vulnerabilities? Will you update them next month or tomorrow? And those are questions that often, again, are not clearly mentioned in the contracts and lead definitely to misalignment and especially a lack of visibility as well, because the client will think that is addressed by the vendor will think that is not part of the scope, and that will leave actually a misalignment and a lack, of course, of security at the end, which might again lead to a compromise of the company and a big challenge afterwards.
Correct. And again, supply chain and third party is so huge when you think about a risk factor today, especially in 2021 and 2022. We've seen a lot of that. And you think about having those T's and C's, really important. And also breach disclosure, right? So when you think about your T's and C's, I want to know when you need to patch, what's your window of patching? Are you going to warn me? If you're breached, what are you going to tell me? Right? What is going to help me if you think I've been breached, that kind of thing. That's all kind of very important. And you think about also in the future, there's a new form of T's and C's coming out called software bill of materials. And this is in its nascent beginnings, right? So the US CISA, for example, which is the US cyber governing body, is talked about coming up with a software bill of materials so that when, let's say, you purchase a new ERP system, if it has an Apache web service, if it has a MongoDB on the back end, right? You're given awareness of that, so it helps you in tracking things and stuff like that. And we should ask that of our vendors. So today, with our vendors, we need to be the ones who do that. Where in the future, laws and stuff like that will give us, almost like when we go to a cereal box and we look inside a cereal box, it tells us what protein and fats and dietary fiber. You'll here's exactly what's in this software, so and help you track them and things like that, which is really going to be important. But it's still on us at this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave. And I wanted also to add, there's a very, I would say, critical phenomenon that I have seen, and I don't like it, to be honest, because there's a lot of security features and updates from third parties that are not by default. It requires companies to pay additional fees. And now, of course, when it comes to very big companies where you have a license, that is a different topic. But when you are a small company, let's take a practical example, in Asia, and you buy a software, and actually that software doesn't have the security by design or by default, but the features require an additional payment for you to activate them. that actually leads to a very big gap in general, and that of course will as well lead to the company not doing that if they don't have the right awareness and understanding of how important is that. So I think it's a collaboration. If there are laws that are coming and enforcing the visibility, enforcing certain standards for companies providing technology, I do believe that that's, you know, a must, because if not, we're making money on something that is very important, like, you know, in analogy with human safety that is regulated. You can't do something, a plane that doesn't fly, right? That's gonna,
Right.
so it's the same. You can't build a software that's insecure by inherently insecure, because that will expose your clients. So I think we need to think a little bit more about that. And if there is a legal, you know, environment or regulatory framework that supports that, it will help the whole world get a little bit more mature. And again, coming back to the social responsibility, it's a responsibility of everyone to protect companies, individuals online.
Agreed, 200%. And the size does not matter, from the smallest to the biggest. And I agree with that 200%. So we talked about discovery, how it needs to be continuous and automated, right? The same is true about testing. So you think about, am I vulnerable? Is this vulnerability really something I need to worry about, right? And the idea is, we talked about the fact time from vulnerability to exploit today is often hours, and is often copied by others. So Log4j, for example, there are over 50 different techniques, tactics, procedures, TTPs, and indicators of compromise for Log4j type events. Everything from nation state actors to botnets to ransomware ransomware providers. That's a new one for me. Ransomware thieves. And so the key is, you need to be able to have a solution, your attack-based vulnerability solution, not only be able to discover these things in an automated fashion, in a continuous way, but also testing, right? Because you need a vendor to update and say, hey, listen, same vulnerability, different TTPs and IOCs, it's coming at you in a different way. And you your security controls that you thought were okay for this is now not the case, right? And often what we found is with various vulnerabilities in our watching people test using our solution to look for vulnerabilities, is as exploits were added to each vulnerability, they actually got more and more serious in what they had to do to protect themselves, and changes to their EDR system, and changes to their firewalls and to their web and email gateway and things like that.
And also, I think, Dave, what is really, again, important is, like, an exploit might not work specifically in a specific environment. So it's much more efficient to understand which exploit might be used within your setup and which doesn't. Because, like, practically what happens is, again, you have a list of CVEs, like, right, and all the CVEs beyond 9 need to be patched before a certain specific time frame. This is what happens most commonly. And now, if you do that, you might actually be overlooking certain CVEs. Perhaps they are less critical, but they might be exploitable, and you are actually prioritizing the wrong ones. And like you said, it's a matter of hours. So if you prioritize the wrong ones because it's just a list for you that looks the same, then you are actually putting your company and your environment at risk. And this is one of the really most difficult tasks that I have seen the teams really struggling with. And not only from the time perspective, but as well from the perspective of understanding all the different characteristics of an exploit, when and how it works, and what are the probabilities of success of a specific one. So I think all those points are also extremely important to discuss and be aware of.
And I would say, beyond the prioritization, the continuous discovery and continuous testing, I think you also already hit upon this, is to do two other things. I'll say what the first one is first. Explain the risk so an executive could understand it. The idea of being able to say, we've tested, we've discovered, these are the 5 things we need to prioritize. And oh, by the way, the risk is production impactful. So the idea is attack-based vulnerability management also needs to be able to do that too. Not just give you, the risk factor from a technical perspective, but from a business impact perspective. So the executive is, okay, we need to fix this. I need to see that number go down.
Yeah, and I think Dave also, it needs to be meaningful for the company. I mean, if you go today and you say, hey, we have 17,000 vulnerabilities, we need to fix 16,995. I mean, it doesn't really specify to the executive what is the risk and why do we need to do that. And for example, interrupt certain applications. So it needs also to be not only relevant to the business, but as well objective and balanced. In our security industry needs to understand as well that there are certain things, like for example critical business applications, that require perhaps a different approach. We can't just launch a patch because we consider that it needs to be done now. It's a communication with the business owner of that application. It's a very clear alignment, understanding the risk, and if they don't, for example, if they decide to accept the risk because they don't want to disrupt the application at all today and they want to fix it next month, they need then to very clearly not only sign off on that risk, but also make sure that they understood it. Because saying, and that I have seen very often, I'm okay with the risk, because the business didn't understand the risk, is a phenomenon that we see very often in Asia as well. But what does it mean, a risk, if a critical vulnerability is present within your system? It means it can be exploited within a specific time frame, making your application unavailable, interrupting your business operations, or leading to a data breach, which if a business owner understands very well, won't be okay with, because obviously they want to continue to provide the services and maintain good operations for the business, right? So I think there is as well this disconnection between showing the vulnerabilities and why do we need to address them versus the risk associated and the prioritization that it requires.
Agreed, very much so. And finally, I think the thing is, a lot of standards out there, from banking to healthcare to privacy across the world, tons of them, are now starting to say, if you're vulnerable, if you have a big risk, you need to document getting rid of that risk. And so the beauty also with attack-based vulnerability management in helping you to prioritize, do continuous discovery, continuous testing, explain risk to executives is that standards piece, is being able to say, here's the answer, right? We do this on a continual basis, and here's the documentation of it, and the reporting on it, and the stuff like that.
Absolutely. And just to add as well on the patch management timeline and the way of how we address fixing those vulnerabilities, I do believe that companies, again, it's a collaboration. It's a collaboration with your business units, it's collaboration with the business stakeholders, but as well with your vendors and partners. We are not working in silo. We are working in an ecosystem. And the vulnerabilities might be within the whole ecosystem, apologies, leading to actually...
You're a trooper. You're a trooper. I know you have a cold, but God bless you. Thank you for coming on the show. You're a trooper.
You're welcome, Dave. So again, it's the ecosystem requires a collaboration, like I mentioned, and I don't want to repeat myself. But again, vulnerabilities can come from anywhere. And you mentioned supply chain again. I mentioned, in general, having those vendors' visibility on the patch management responsibilities. But I think if we go back of what we have been discussing, first, we need that discovery document. We need to know where are those vulnerabilities. And in order to know where are those vulnerabilities, we need to understand our ecosystem much wider than before. Afterwards, we need to address those vulnerabilities. But addressing those vulnerabilities is not a trivial task anymore. We're not talking about one or two. We're talking about thousands of vulnerabilities. Addressing thousands of vulnerabilities requires resources and time. So we need prioritization, and we need to focus as well on what's the most important. And that is not, again, a very easy task.
Right. And again, that's something with attack-based vulnerability management that you get into, right? The idea of being able to do all these things and stuff like that, which is excellent. Well, awesome. Magda, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. This has been awesome. And I look forward to having you here again. And thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for attending. This has been the Simulate Cybersecurity broadcast.
Thank you very much, David. It was a pleasure.